I mostly came for the water.
That's fantastic.
Yes, success. Those of you who were at the Wix Engineering conference yesterday and saw me speak, I'd like to note I'm wearing a green sweater. Most of the room is like, I don't know what that means. That's okay.
This is Roy's other sweater, just for everyone's.
Yes, this is my second sweater. Somebody's red-green color line. Should we, oh, hey, it's 6 now. It's 6 upvotes. People really want to know about
Really want to know this.
identifying toxic company cultures. I've never seen that before, so yeah. I don't.
I've only ever worked in amazing companies, I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. Do you want to take a first stab at this?
Why don't you start, because I'm eating pizza.
That's the best time to make you talk.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a very small table here, if anyone needs a very small table. Toxic culture is an interesting phrase.
No, not this one. That one is for recording. This one is for talking.
Ah, there we go. Is this? Hello? Ah, there we go. Fantastic. Now can you hear me? Brilliant. So I don't need to shout. I've just been teaching a class in this room all day. So if my voice just fails at some point, then Roy will continue in the form of like interpretive dance or stand up or something. It'll be amazing.
Totally ready.
Toxic culture. I guess this is one of those, this is the point in the evening where you unpack the words culture and toxic, right?
You're not going to answer the question, are you? You're just going to like go semantic.
No, I think it's really important. So toxic culture is a whole bunch of different things. I really hope, Roy, you're going to use an example that we spoke about a couple of days ago about safety and things, but we can get to that in a bit. I'm just throwing Roy under a bus here. So culture is everything about how it feels to be in an organization. That's my sense of what culture is. You can go into an organization. So we have very different hats, right? We have very different roles. So Roy is inside the tent causing mischief, and I'm outside the tent causing mischief. Okay, that's how we kind of work. So Roy's been inside Netflix causing mischief for a bunch of time, and now he's inside Slack causing mischief. Let's see how long for.
True fact.
I'm a consultant, so I tend to go into I see lots of different organizations. And you really can. You can tell when you go in, you can tell when you walk the floors, you can tell when you speak to people how they feel about being there, what it's like to be in that organization. And some organizations are energizing to be in. Right? I've just spent 2 days with a bunch of folks from Wix, and they are clearly having fun. Right? That's what I know about Wix. I didn't know Wix before today. I mean, I knew the company, I knew the product, whatever. I hadn't spent any time with them. They're clearly having fun, right? And that's part of their culture. And they are clearly trying stuff, and that's part of their culture as well. So how to spot toxic culture? I think one of the things that I look for is when people aren't saying things, right? If people aren't speaking out, there's a couple of reasons for that. People aren't speaking out because they're afraid to speak out. People aren't speaking out because other people have spoken out before them and they're not there anymore, or they get shouted at or shouted down. So toxic culture is about whether people, well, there's a bunch of things. Whether people at the different levels in the organization, in the different parts of the organization, feel that they have the ability, the autonomy to execute. Because if you have the ability, autonomy to execute, that means that you're in a fairly healthy place. We were just talking actually a little bit earlier about, so autonomy, I've been thinking about this word autonomy a lot. I'm just going to ramble for a bit. So I see autonomy as 5 things, okay? The first thing autonomy is permission. So if you've got a bunch of teams and they're going to do stuff, the first thing they need is permission. That's the easy one. Here, you have permission. There you go, I did it, right? So permission is the first thing they need. Let's think about, so the analogy I use is like flying a plane or driving a car or something, right? So you have permission to drive a car, and you go, thanks. That would be great if I knew how to drive a car. Oh, okay, right, so now we need kind of skills and capabilities, right? So we need to learn how to drive a car, so there's the capabilities piece. So now I have permission to drive a car, and I know how to drive a car, which is useless to me because I don't have a car. So, okay, you're going to need a car. So the next thing we need is resources. Okay, so I need permission, I need skills, and I need resources. In order to be autonomous, And this, I think, is a really significant part of autonomy that people miss, and certainly when I hear about things like programmer anarchy. Another thing you need in order to be autonomous is a goal, right, is a purpose. Kent Beck, there was a wonderful tweet of his last year sometime. He says, autonomy without accountability is vacation. Right? I really like that. So in order to be autonomous, there needs to be an accountability. There needs to be a goal. But the fifth part, and this again is the difference between lots and lots of teams operating autonomously to achieve a common outcome and a bunch of people going nuts, is I need enabling constraints, right? I need a framework in which. And so my car analogy, we might say, okay, so I know how to drive a car, but if I just go out in here and I'm British, so we drive on the left. So I'm going to pull out of the garage, I'm going to drive down the street, and what's going to happen? I'm probably going to kill someone, maybe me, right? It's not going to work. So there's things that are arbitrary decisions, but we all agree what those arbitrary decisions are, and we call those idioms, conventions. So in order for me to be autonomous within an organization or within a construct, I need to know what our conventions and our idioms are. I need to know what good looks like around here. And once I can know that, I can be autonomous. I can go after my goal. I know what good looks like. I know that I'm making similar decisions that my peers would make. I don't need to check in with them so much. Okay? So that definition of autonomy, I don't see very often. When I do see it, it's a very, very powerful construct. But for me, you could take any one of those axes, any one of those 5 dimensions, and remove it, and you've created toxicity. Right? So if we took away permission, so you can do all these things, but no one's going to let you. That's a really horrible, constraining environment. What do we do then? We subvert, right? We go under the radar, we buck the system, we cheat, we do all the things. If I don't have the skills and capabilities, I'm going to make stuff up, okay, and bad things ensue. If I don't have the resources, I'm going to beg, borrow, and steal the resources, or I'm going to get frustrated, I'm going to act out. If I don't have a goal, if I don't have accountability, I'm just going to drift. And I don't know how many of you have been in a role where you maybe had all the permission and authority in the world, but no purpose. Purposelessness is it's a mind killer. It's soul destroying. And then the fifth one, if I don't know what our norms are, I'm liable to fall foul of this pretty quickly. So I think if you can go after those 5 things, then you end up in a context where you have genuine autonomy and you do have a healthy enabling culture. So.
I'm not nearly as contextual as Dan. I think that was a great definition, of toxicity, though I would argue that one thing that I feel like it missed is potentially it focused on doing the work. Mm-hmm. It didn't necessarily focus on aspects of working in the place that are not work-related.
Yes, I completely agree.
And as a white guy in a white guy-dominated tech culture, that's probably a pretty good answer, but it may not be a complete answer. I've certainly talked to coworkers of mine at previous companies about they had all the ability to do the work, but being a woman or being black sucked in that company, mm-hmm. and that was a particularly sort of localized version of toxicity. So how do we figure out whether or not a given company culture is toxic? And I'm assuming, by the way, I'm going to make up some version of this, which is that you're trying to look at a company from the outside and figure out if it's toxic. And I would argue that it comes down to asking questions. I don't know what it's like to interview in Israel in tech. I was born and raised here, but I've never actually worked here as an adult. In the US, one of the points I make with every candidate I speak with, like that first conversation, is this conversation is meant to answer 2 questions. It's meant to answer my question about whether or not you might be a great fit here, and it's meant to answer your question about whether or not we are a great fit for you. It's a 2-way street. So I would look at every conversation you have with a company as an opportunity to sort of figure out what the culture looks like. And what that means is, as you develop your own understanding of toxicity and what matters to you and what doesn't, then you can start figuring out what kind of questions help you understand whether or not that's a problem. I personally wouldn't work for some companies, and I'm not going to mention Uber by name, that have internal company cultures that are bad for people who don't look like me. I have friends I actually kind of respect. I have friends I kind of love who actually don't have that problem. So they don't need to filter for that. Like, they just don't care. They just want good work. And I don't have to agree with their, morals to be their friend. So fundamentally, it comes down to asking questions and figuring out what's important to you. So for example, there's probably no faster way to get me to become a complete jerk and ineffective and terribly hard to manage than taking away my autonomy. Autonomy is incredibly critical to me. And so when I sit down with a prospective manager, I actually ask them about, for example, what happens if we disagree? Are there decisions that if we disagree go my way, or do you feel like every decision that I make you can override? And if somebody gives me the answer, and they have, that, well, obviously I'm accountable for your decisions, so, I want you to have autonomy, but if we disagree, then we're going to have to resolve it, otherwise, it's my way. I go okay, awesome, not a great fit, have a nice day. The other thing that I care about is managers who actually deeply care about managing people. So I asked them questions about managing people and being thoughtful about people. And I remember talking to a VP of engineering at some company back in July, and I asked him a people question, and he literally couldn't figure out how to answer that question. It didn't make sense to him because in his head, that's not what you deal with. You deal with technology. So figure out what's important to you. Figure out what versions of toxicity actually matter to you and what not. I'm not going to judge. It's whatever works for you. And figure out what questions about the company and about that person actually sort of have the opportunity to expose that. And if you have a specific version of that you'd like to, have a question or two for, throw it up there and get it upvoted, and I'll tell you what I think. I'm always going to tell you what I think. I'm Israeli. That's no longer the top one. Oh, hey, how do I motivate highly skeptical, burnt-out engineers? You want to go first?
How do I motivate highly skeptical, burnt-out engineers? I've done this. So this isn't a hypothetical, how would I?
I've been this.
So, Roy, let's talk about why you're burnt out and why you're highly skeptical and what would help you, what would bring you back into the game.
You're full of shit, and you don't really care about me, so I don't know why we're having this conversation.
Right, there we go. Now, Roy did something that most people won't do in that kind of situation, and this refers back to toxic culture, which is he was candid and honest, right? And so I always take this back to, I kind of really want to talk about the what's it called, the toxic culture thing again.
Let it go, man.
I know, right? I know. Oh, highly skeptical, burnt-out engineers. Those two things tend to go hand in hand. Burnout is a real thing. Okay. Skepticism is a thing that happens often when you're approaching burnout, because you become aware that no one cares, or you start to believe that no one cares. Okay. So, highly skeptical burnout engineers. I want to separate those two things out. How do you engage highly skeptical engineers, and how do you engage burnt out engineers? I think there's two different elements to that, and I think that when the two things combine, then there's a third part. So how do I engage burnt out engineers? There's an easy part to this, which is send them the heck home. Right? Honestly, go away. Go away. I do not want to see you for a month. I don't want to see you for... Just go and rest. Go and not be here. Right? Go and be somewhere that isn't here. Whatever's been going on here has led to you being and it may be your wider ecology. It may be something going on in your life. I don't know. But I do know that right now you're here and you're burning out. You're burnt out. That's not good for you. That's not good for the organization. That's not good for the people around you. Don't be here. Right? And don't be here is a duty of care thing. Yeah, so if I've got burnout engineers, don't be here as a duty of care thing. This is a pretty good indicator of toxicity of an organisation, is when someone is burnt out and we do need to send them away to rest, do we jettison them? Do we say, right, we've burnt Roy out, we'd better go now? Or do we say, do you know what, we really value your contribution and you're burnt out, and we are at least partly the cause of that, we need to care about you and send you home and whatever else. I mean, it may not just be rest, it may be counselling, therapy, actual, human soul contact type stuff. So how do I re-engage the burnout engineer? Start to care, right? Wider than that is when I see someone burnt out, and particularly when I see groups of people burnt out, because that happens too, is I don't look at the people burnt out. I look at the system of work they're in, the organizational construct they're in is presenting as these people are burnt out. Okay? That means we've broken the organization because we've built a system of work that ends up with these people burning out. And do you know what? We could jack these people up and roll a bunch of new people in who are all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and guess what's going to happen to those people within a few months? I'm going to end up with a bunch of people who are burnt out and disillusioned because our system of work does that. So the first thing I do is pan back. And I pan back and I say, how does work in this organization or in this part of the organization such that, and how does care and feeding work, and how do human beings interact in this part of the organization such that these people are burning out? There's often things to go after there. In terms of re-engaging, I see that as a breach of trust, right? So what I need to do now is, I'm putting on my manager hat now, if I'm managing this or if I'm responsible for this part of the organization, I need to re-establish their trust. Right now, I've let them down, or the organization's let them down. They're burnt out. They owe me nothing, right? I need to re-engage them. I need to earn their trust again. I need to create an environment where they can flourish, they can care, they can get engaged, they can do meaningful work, they can work in meaningful teams, and that kind of stuff. And in some organizations, I can't do that. And in some organizations, the right thing is for them to not be there. Right? So, and I've dismantled parts of organizations where it was clearly this part of the organization can't work. Right? So that's the burnt out thing. The demotivated thing, the highly skeptical thing, is I actually find that really fun to engage with, right? Because highly skeptical usually means smart, observant, and fairly convinced that what we're doing right now is dumb. And usually when smart, observant people think what we're doing is dumb, why might that be? It might be because what we're doing is dumb, right? That's signal. And if a whole bunch of people are skeptical, then we're definitely doing something dumb, and that's not just signal, that's like, that's an alert, yeah? So I want to, again, pan back from that and say, right, what on earth are we doing such that these people think we're a bunch of idiots, yeah? Now, sometimes, unfortunately, that signal is delayed. So they've been skeptical for a while because a bunch of dumb things happened, and we might be right now in the process of doing something quite sensible, but they've still got their dumb filter on, right? And so now I'm getting a false signal, so that can be interesting. A real example, going into organizations, and for instance, a lot of what I do is about flow and getting people thinking about how work moves through the organization. And these people, they have change fatigue, they have consultant fatigue, and yet another idiot coming in and telling them they're doing it all wrong. But I'm clever, and I'm different, and I'm special. No, I'm not, right? Maybe I am getting it completely wrong. Maybe I don't know about their context, and maybe they're exactly right to be skeptical. There was one gig when I was working with a well-known consulting firm a few years ago. I went into a bank, and we were doing this whole thing, and there's one quite older guy, and he was clearly checked out. He wasn't having any of it. And I said to him, you're not engaging in this at all, are you? He went, no, I'm not. I said, do you mind if I ask why? He said, yep. He said, yep, I've seen it all before. He said, basically, I'm just going to keep my head down, you're going to roll through, you'll go on your way, and the next methodology will just come rolling on in, and I'm 5 years from retirement. And I was like, I've got nothing. There is nothing. This guy doesn't care, he's checked out. Yeah. So there's skeptical as signal, and there's skeptical as, institutionalized, right? So how do I again, the duty of care is on me. The onus is on me to demonstrate that this thing that I want them to do is valuable, is useful, will engage them. And this is a visceral thing. And I've done this before where, you're working in an organization for some months, and they start off and they're all kind of checked out and gloomy and whatever. And you demonstrate by doing, right? So you embed yourself in the team, and you clearly have way too much fun. And if you're clearly having way too much fun, people get suspicious. And they're like, he's clearly having way too much. How's he having that much fun? You go, oh, come on, I'll show you. let's pair on this really interesting thing. And they go, oh, actually, yeah, work could be fun. And after a while, if you're infectious enough, you end up like the whole team after 6 months, 9 months, a year, they kind of come bouncing into work, right? And they're energized, and it's fun, and it's exciting. And you look at your buddies, and you did that, and that's really cool. That's really exciting. There's something really human about doing work, right? And if it's not joyful, if it's not enjoyable, if it's not fun, find something that is. Where you can influence the environment you're in, go after those things. Where you can't, Martin Fowler said it brilliantly many years ago. He said, if you can't change your employer, change your employer, right? So try and change the construct you're in. If you can't, maybe you're in the wrong place anyway.
I really agree with your assertion that burned out and skeptical are actually very different. Some of the most skeptical and people I've worked with were highly engaged and not burned out at all. Mm-hmm. And in fact, much like you, I think, to some degree, think of people being skeptical as like, you still give a shit about the place. Mm-hmm. I think teams of people being burned out is probably an indicator of some sort of organizational problem. Yeah. One of the interesting things about working at Netflix was that Netflix basically, at least in my team, I didn't tell people what to do. And I didn't actually manage people's workload. And that meant that there was no necessarily sort of organizational reason why you might be burnt out, other than you're doing a bunch of work, you're enjoying it, and suddenly you realize you're doing like way too much of it. And I knew who on my team was in danger of doing that at any given point. And at some point I actually remember sitting down with an engineer who was like, I have discovered I'm burnt out. And I was like, cool. So, like, what's going on? And it turned out that, like, he was renovating his house. And, the problem is that basically everybody he needed to deal with was open during the weekdays, which is, like, when he was trying to, like, work. And it was a problem. And I was like, okay, listen, why don't you just take Fridays off for a while? And he was like, wait, we can do that? And I was like, the hell? And we didn't even have at Netflix, we didn't have metered vacation, right? So you can take as much as you want. You didn't ask for your boss's approval to take vacation. So it was like this weird thing where it's like he just hadn't considered doing that. And it was a really simple sort of way to rebalance the work-life thing. With skepticism, so first of all, I think that some level of skepticism, as you noted, is actually super helpful. It keeps us honest. And sometimes, as you noted, sometimes people sort of learn to be skeptical. And the only thing I have for that is being super honest and being very clear about my limitations. I remember I joined a company a while ago, like 2009, and I had my first meeting with all of my engineers, and one of them asked me a question. How are we going to do this thing? I don't even remember what it was. And I thought about it for a second, and I was like, I don't know. And we continued the conversation, and 6 months later, he said, that moment when you said, I don't know, is when I started considering the possibility that I could actually believe you. Because every other manager I've ever had would give me some sort of bullshit answer that was very clearly not real. So I think being honest is really important. And that means that, for example, I don't actually believe, there's this myth, I would argue, that if the company wants to do something and you disagree, well, you should just come to your people and say, this is absolutely the right thing to do. You should essentially represent the company to your people, and I fundamentally don't believe that. Because if your people don't believe that what you believe is what they get, well, they're going to be skeptical of you, and that's basically when you lose the game. Mm-hmm. So that's what I've got. What's our next question? Or did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. We need 2 mics because this works much better as a conversation. Where was my brain then? I think, I just wanted to pick up on the honesty thing. I think people in general are very good at recognizing integrity, and they're very good at recognizing a lack of integrity. And when you are Roy being authentically Roy versus Roy spouting the company line, it's pretty obvious, unless you genuinely believe your company line, in which case you're Roy being authentic Roy. I think most of us are like that. And people have pretty good, I think, spidey sense about when that's happening and when it's not happening. The problem, or at least the challenge as a manager, and it probably becomes more the further up the organization you get, especially in the bigger, more hierarchical organizations, is that not knowing can be seen as weakness, right? And not knowing, saying you don't know, genuinely, I've no idea, right? Or your guess is as good as mine, requires a certain vulnerability and a certain humility that says, I don't mind looking like an idiot. And it turns out you're looking at two people who don't mind looking like idiots, and we've both done our fair share of looking like idiots in our careers, I have to imagine. I certainly have.
And yeah, for me it was like in the last 5 minutes.
And yeah, Roy does this professionally, right? So but no, it takes practice to let down your guard, right? Professionally, it takes practice to say to a team, and the way I discovered this was completely by accident, by royally screwing up leading a team. And I royally screwed up leading a team, and so my immediate responsibility was to say, okay, guys, I just completely screwed up. And it didn't occur to me that that was a thing. I just went, I just really screwed up. And they're like, you just said you screwed up. I was like, that's because I screwed up, right? That's what you say when you screw up. And they're like, no, but you're supposed to kind of, do the bluster thing and then pretend that was... And I didn't know that that was like breaking the rules, right? It was like, letting people know I screwed up. What it then did, two things happened. And again, this was a complete fluke. One thing was that the team started taking a lot more chances, a lot more risks, because the team members were much less afraid to screw up, because Dan had, right? And so that seems to be acceptable behaviour, right? Dan didn't fire himself. Turns out we're okay. And so the team, and another thing that happened was the team started being a lot more authentic with each other, right? I didn't anticipate, I'm not nearly smart enough to have played for that. But then I saw this behaviour happening. I was smart enough, or at least observant enough, to clock that and go, that's useful. I'm going to put that in the bank and see if that works again. Right? Not by deliberately screwing up, because that's really obvious. Again, you're being unauthentic and manipulative. But just by making it very clear that these are my rules, these are my terms of reference. Right? If you're not screwing up from time to time, it's because you're not trying very hard. It's because you're staying well within the lines, and we don't succeed by staying well within the lines, right? We don't advance by staying well within the lines. I've seen teams, I've seen organisations where you punish people for breaking the build, right? So then guess what? People are super conservative about not breaking the build. No, break the build, because breaking the build means you're trying stuff we haven't tried before, and our build wasn't ready for that. Well done, because now our build becomes ready for that, and that's how we make progress. So you create a culture in which people are going to take risks. Calculated risk, but they're going to take risks, and in which they're going to be more authentic with each other. And I think if you can start to broach those things, that's when you get into that authenticity, and that's when you can start engaging that skepticism as a really healthy, positive energy. I just wanted to pick up on your authenticity comment.
Thank you. And adding to something you said about failure, I have 3 managers reporting to me, and at some point I started doing something about 2 months or so ago that I've never done before, but turns out to be actually kind of cool. We start every staff meeting going around the table talking about something we've screwed up in the last week. And I go first. And it's true that for most of the people around that table, they may not have something they screwed up in the last week. Part of my role as a role model is to make sure that I always screw up. That's the only reason I screw up, by the way. It's to demonstrate that it's safe.
I completely, yeah.
Yes. But talking about failure is incredibly powerful, because our job is to make failure safe. Shall we go on to the next one? Or did you want to?
I just wanted to add one thing to that. So there's a company in the UK called Skyscanner, and they're like Kayak or something. They're kind of, cheap flights mapping thing. And I went to meet them a couple of years ago. And they do this at scale. So they have every Monday morning, 10 o'clock, in the main meeting room thing, they have Screw Up of the Week. Right? And anyone can turn up and offer Screw Up of the Week. And sometimes there's a queue of 2 or 3 people who want to offer Screw Up of the Week. And it's for exactly this reason. A, it's to make that stuff safe. But also, each person will get up, and they're usually ops type screw-ups, because something died in production or whatever. Or they're usually operational screw-ups, rather, and it may be the operational screw-up once we dug into it. But what they'll do is they'll play it back as almost like as a case study, which is kind of cool. So they'll say, this is the screw-up, this is what we did, this is what went wrong. This is when we recognized it. This is how we knew something bad had happened. This is how we responded to it. This is how we resolved it. This is what we're going to do as a result of that having happened. And then it goes thrown open to a Q&A. Like, how did you know this thing, or when did you discover that thing, or did you consider this thing? And then they chat about it for a bit, and the next one goes up. And there's there could be, as I say, 2 or 3 of these screw-ups of the week on a Monday morning. And it's quite a fun, energizing way to start the week. And it's a great communications kind of broadcast strategy. And again, it embeds that like, it's okay to screw up. It's not okay not to learn from it. Because not learning is dumb, screwing up is life, right? And it's just a wonderfully kind of empowering message. Move on?
Yeah, I think so. I have no idea how to actually mark that answered.
So I think what we do... Oops.
Yeah.
There we go. That's a little archive button.
Oh, cool.
What comes after Agile is dead.
Oh, you have all of this.
Oh, hang on. I could. Where did my highly motivated engineers go? Oh, it's done that thing again, hasn't it?
So this is fun.
This is fun. This is how you get to plug in. Anyway, right. What comes after Agile is dead. I call shenanigans on the question, I think.
What? You can't. We're here to answer their questions.
I'm going to answer the question. So this suggests that there's a thing called Agile, and that thing called Agile is going to die, and then there'll be another thing that comes along. So this is interesting. Agile, people mean different things by Agile, so I'm going to tell you what I mean by Agile, I'm going to tell you what I think most people think of as Agile. What most people think of as Agile is Scrum. Okay? The way you... so what happened was this. 15 years ago or so, 17 years ago, crikey. February 2001 in Utah. 17 middle-aged white guys got together. Linda Rising calls it the Council of Middle-Aged White Guys. Bob Martin.
Yay.
2 white guys sitting at a... so Bob Martin, who's most of his friends are middle-aged white guys, so so he's seeing a thing happening. This is all through the mid-late 90s. Massive projects, massive amounts of money sunk into things, massive failures, whatever else. And there were a bunch of people running around trying to deliver software differently. And each of them had developed their own flavor of delivering software differently, but they all had basically 3 things in common. Work in small chunks, get feedback, care about engineering. Right? As long as you basically do those 3 things, you're probably going to be all right. Okay? So work in small chunks, because then there's less stuff at risk, and also it means I can find out sooner whether I'm doing the right thing. Get feedback. That feedback is from human beings. That feedback is from your process. That feedback is from your tooling. Take engineering seriously, otherwise the first 2 aren't sustainable. Right? And they'd come up with all these different methods, and there was a thing called extreme programming, there was a thing called DSDM, there was a thing called Crystal, there was feature-driven development, Peter Code, there was adaptive, there was Scrum, lots and lots of these different methods. And all the people that represented these methods, Bob Martin gathered them all together, and he said, look, we've got more in common than we have different, so let's come up with an umbrella market. It's a marketing exercise. Let's come up with an umbrella term to articulate the thing that we've got in common, so we can all stand behind that. And they went, oh, that's a good idea. And they said, well, let's call it adaptive. Let's call it adaptive. The thing that we all have in common is that we can adapt to new information. We can adapt to uncertainty. And they went, that's a brilliant name. And then someone said, wait, well, he's got a method already called adaptive. And one of the folks in the room had a method called adaptive. And he said, honestly, I'm fine, take the word. If that's the right word, take the word. And they went, no, we don't want to steal your market share, whatever. What's our second choice word? Agile. So agile wasn't even their first choice word. It was just the next word they thought of. It began with an A. They didn't get as far as aardvark. So they went with agile. And agile meant an umbrella term for all of these different methods. And then what happened is different people came up with different ways to kind of turn this into business, and Scrum decided to monetize it. Okay? And just to give you a ballpark here, back of an envelope calculation, there are over 500,000 people in the world with certified Scrum Master certificates. Okay? Let's say conservatively they spend a couple of $1,000 on that. That is literally a $1 billion industry in certification. Right? That apparently is how you make money out of Agile. Right? Is you sell certification. What that meant, sadly, is that it crushed all the other ones. So no one's really heard of Crystal, and XP is a distant memory for a few people who like all that stuff, and so on. Yeah. So Agile, for me, is what's in the manifesto. It's people and interactions are more important than processes and tools. Processes and tools are important. We need those things. Caring about people and their interactions is more important. Documenting software is important, right? Tutorials are important. Tests are important. All that stuff's important. Actually working software, actually things that people can use is more important, and so on. Yeah? So the concept of agility, the principles of agility, I think are universal. Right? Being able to adapt to change over not being able to adapt to change. Well, this is your definition of fitness to survive, right? You can survive if you can adapt to change, if and only if you can adapt to change. So that's just a universal. What will happen once people eventually realize that Scrum is 25 years old, okay, over 25 years old, hasn't changed materially in that 25 years and is still presenting itself as a new thing, well, that would be interesting, because finally we can get some work done, right? Because Scrum, when it came out, when it was invented, was game-changing. It brought multi-year releases down to a few months, right? It brought massive, enormous programs of work down to handfuls of people, which is fantastic. Bring that forward 25 years. 25. Who's been in software more than 25 years in this room? Right? 3 people have been in software more than 20, right?
I started as a child.
So, absolutely. And he's a lot younger than he looks. He's a pup, really. It's all dye. He just colours his hair to look more grown up. So for all of your career, Scrum's existed. It's just been around. It's a thing, right? The premises, the presuppositions, the assumptions that Scrum has 25 years ago, most of those things are irrelevant now. So now I can spin up half a dozen ideas in a morning, right, on someone else's hardware. I can have thousands of servers running that aren't my servers, and it costs me $5, right? That's the world I live in now. In the Scrum world of the early 90s, it took me 6 months to get a server, and it was rubbish. Yeah? So a lot of the constraints have changed enormously. Scrum is optimized for planning over numbers of weeks and delivering over numbers of months. If I can have 6 ideas in a morning, Scrum will still plan over a number of weeks and deliver over a number of months. Right? So the world's changed, yeah? And Scrum hasn't moved on with it. And so now we, institutionally, and this is the cargo culting again, we still believe this is a sensible way to write software. So what I hope will happen is once Scrum dies, we will then get back to agility, which is a much more interesting proposition. And agility is responding to customer need, responding to internal stakeholder need, looking after each other, right? Caring about that stuff. Building great software that we don't care about because we're going to destroy it and replace it with other great software, right? That kind of mindset, that's agility. And I really, I'm a big fan of agility. And I see an awful lot of long in the tooth, dyed in the wool, vestigial, air quotes, agile methodologies who are still basically in the certificate printing industry holding us back, which is a shame.
Actually, I don't think I have anything useful to add to that. Oh. What are some red flags to look for in interviewing in a company?
Do you want to take this one or should I take this one?
Oh, you start. That'll give me a few minutes.
Okay. So there we go. You can. Roy's like, I'm just off to stretch my legs.
I've got to check Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. So don't any more Scrum questions. I'll tell you, it's a red button. So I worked at a company called ThoughtWorks for a bunch of years, and one of the main things I did there, because one of the main things everyone does in a good consulting firm, is recruiting. And ThoughtWorks, I think, still has one of the best recruiting pipelines of any organization I've encountered. When I left there, I went to work for a trading firm, and the guy that set up the recruiting process at ThoughtWorks had set up the recruiting pipeline in the new place as well, and it was equally brilliant. It was different, but it was equally brilliant. Red flags when interviewing at a company. So I want to answer this from both sides, right? From the candidate side and from the interviewer side. because I think both of them are interesting and make a nice contrast. When you are interviewing, when you are in the pipeline, in the process of interviewing a company, well, you see, there was a Freudian slip. You are interviewing the company. An interview is a two-way conversation. Okay, it's a buying conversation. So whenever I interview someone, I'm after two outcomes from that interview. And if I don't get both of those, I count the interview as a fail. The first thing is this. Okay, Avram, we spent a bunch of time together. I really want to progress this. I have enough evidence that I can choose to progress this. I can say, yep, I know enough about you that I think this would be a good fit, and I think I want you to meet some other people. I want you to have enough information to make the same buying decision. Right? I think it is not just legitimate but healthy to get to the end of an interview to say, Roy, this has been a great conversation. I really want to progress this. And Roy to say, thanks, Dan, but with respect, what I've learned is this probably isn't the thing I wanted to interview for. It sounds like a really interesting position, but what I thought it was this thing over here, and it turns out it's this thing over there, and thanks for your time, right? If he has enough information to select out, that was a healthy interview. What I will say, and I'll say this so I do this from an interviewer perspective, and I now also do this from an interviewee perspective. The entire thing of an interview, the entire point of it, or the meat of an interview is evidence. Okay? From an interviewer perspective, there's a legal duty of care there. Because if someone says, you passed me over because discrimination or because whatever is actionable, I need to be able to defend my decision and say, no, we passed on this, and this evidence. As an interviewee, it's a super useful game to have as well in your back pocket. So I want to share it with you because I think it's wonderfully powerful. And if any of you, when you're interviewing now, I want you to do this. There's essentially 4 types of evidence that are useful in an interview context. There's credential evidence. What are you qualified to do? That's the easy one, right? What qualifications do you have? There's experiential evidence. What have you done? So an experiential question might be, tell me about your last project. Tell me about the last project you really enjoyed doing. Tell me what happened on that project. Play that back to me. And I'm learning about him and I'm getting some evidence, some experiential evidence. The third one is hypothetical evidence. What would you do if? So a thing I like to do in an interview is to say, tell me about the last thing you did, and they go, tell me about the last thing I did, and I gauge their enthusiasm and where they take it and all that kind of stuff. And then I might say, if you could do that all again, what would you do differently? That's now a hypothetical question. Yeah? And the fourth type of evidence is opinion. What do you think about serverless? What do you think about, Kubernetes? What do you think about cross-functional teams? And I want to know how he argues something, and I might disagree with him just to see how he defends his position. And I might want to learn whether he's a strong opinions, weakly held person, or whether he's I heard this idea once and I'm never going to let it go and I can't defend it, but I don't know why I'm not going to let it go. And I can learn a lot about someone by asking them what they think. Yeah. But likewise, as a candidate, you can ask exactly the same kinds of questions, and you can guide that conversation. Here's a trick. Once you understand what the interview is about and that it's a bi-directional conversation and it's a buying conversation, most interviewers don't know how to interview. Which means this. Once you know that, you can basically guide the interview any way you like. Right? You can take the interview off in whatever direction you want, and they'll go, oh, this is... And sometimes they'll feel rescued. Oh, thank God, one of us knows what we're doing. Right? Phew. Roy, thanks for asking that really good question. Let's chat for a bit. Yeah. So, yeah, these are not the droids you're looking for, right? Jedi mind trick. So some of the red flags I'm looking for at a company, if someone just goes through a list of questions robotically and they're not really interested in me, okay? I will ask about things like diversity and inclusion and those things, not because I'm a politically correct nerd, but because I know that diverse organisations, diverse teams are more effective than monochromatic and mono-gendered and monocultural teams, okay? Because people with different backgrounds and opinions and heritages and genders and world life experiences are likely to bring different things to the conversation. And so if I'm looking around the office when I'm being interviewed and I'm just seeing a sea of, 20-something white guys, that's going to make me a bit nervous, right? So that's a red flag right there. I've been in interviews as a candidate where the interviewer is using really gendered language, maybe sexism, whatever. They're just kind of, and that's, if that's a cultural norm at an interview, what the heck's going on back in the office, right? Those sorts of things. So, and again, it's toxic culture, right? This is, in actual fact, this is how do you spot a toxic culture by another guy? How do you spot a toxic culture before you join the company? I will, hopefully, before I go for the interview, I've done my research about the product and what the company does and its values, and I might ask about those things. I might ask about, what are you, interviewer, how would you describe the company's values, and how would you describe how they align with your values? What kind of things do you care about, and why are you here? So those are some of the things I might go after. But, yeah, as an interviewee, you want evidence, because if you're going to select out, you want evidence. And also it reminds you, and I'll do this, I'll take a piece of paper and I'll draw like a cross on it, so I've got 4 quadrants, so I'll take 4 index cards in or whatever. And while I'm being interviewed, I'm glancing down and I'm seeing where I'm light on evidence on the company, and I'll ask questions that kind of go off in that direction. So I'm looking for data, right? I don't just want to come out and go, oh, and in the same way, you interview someone, oh, what do you think? He was a nice guy. She was a really smart candidate. What's your evidence for that? Oh, I just really liked talking to her and she had a lot to say about... No, what's the actual evidence for that? Red flags, think about your values, okay? And your values aren't what you say your values are how you act, right? So look at how you act. What kind of things do you care about? Because if the organisation you're interviewing for doesn't care about the things you care about, you won't last long, right? You won't last long because that conflict of values will wear you down. And as Deming said, a bad system will beat a good person every time. You can go in there with every intention in the world of changing everything, right? And what will happen is it will crush you. And it will probably crush you slowly enough that you won't notice yourself being crushed. You will end up burning out. Okay, so for me, the red flags thing is alignment of values. Are the sorts of things that you clearly care about when we spoke in the interview, the sorts of things I clearly care about? I remember when I interviewed at ThoughtWorks as a candidate, my tech interview, within 5 minutes we were like, I'm going to like you, right? And I could tell you why, but I won't. But basically there was a fairly brief exchange on a fairly well-known technology that we both thought was just a complete charade. And we both twigged fairly early on that we both thought this thing was a complete charade, and we just went, you spotted that as well. What else have you spotted? And then we carried on talking, and I just thought, I want to work with this guy. I want this guy as my boss, right, as my tech lead. And he was thinking, I want Dan in my team, and he hired me. Right? So sometimes you just connect and you meet over some shared value, but the red flags thing is all about values and all about the things that you hold dear and the things that the organisation, the way the organisation behaves, the values it betrays through that.
I think that liking candidates is one of the things I worry about the most.
Yeah, I concur.
And once I notice that I like a candidate, I'm much more certainly on my toes, being wary, because I like this guy, and it's like quite often people who look like us are like a guy, is the worst possible reason to hire somebody.
No, she's hot. Or he's hot, or whatever. Right.
What's your name?
Shy.
Shy is right. Sorry. So I think it really does come to what I agree, what your values are, and then figure out, what the red flags are with that regard. So for example, diversity matters to me. I've interviewed in places where my entire panel was white guys. I wrote a blog post about joining Slack, and I talked about the interview process at Slack, and one of the things I said was I had 8 technical people on my interview panel, and 5 of them were women. And when I got the interview panel lineup, I contacted my recruiter and I was like, I just want you to know, 5 of 8 of these people are women, and I noticed this. And he was like, yeah, that's pretty much what we do. I think that it's also worth noting that if you want to guide the interview, you better be sure that you're actually the better person at the interviewing in the room, because I have asked candidates who tried to do that, because as soon as you're basically trying to play me,
Yeah.
the game is done. With people who are less qualified, you might be able to do that. I'm not sure it's what you should do.
No,
though.
of course it's not.
It's like having a first date where you're basically trying to, play the other person. The one thing I will note that I actually disagree with you about,
Okay.
literally the one thing I disagree with you about, is my current company actually has a predefined set of questions for every slot in the interview.
Mm-hmm.
So the strategy section has some questions you're supposed to ask. And the people section has some questions you're supposed to ask. And I really don't like that. Or at least I really didn't like that, because I was all about like, hey Dan, let's go into a room and we'll get to know each other and like we'll figure out whether or not we're right for each other and all of that stuff. But one of the things I've come to see is that this is a fantastic tool for establishing consistency and fighting implicit bias. Because if we ask everybody the same set of questions, and if we have a rubric for what a good answer for this question looks like, we can deal and factor out a whole lot of this person actually, we like this person, so they would probably be good here. Or this person is hot, they would probably be good here. So it's still not something that intrinsically comes naturally to me. Like what I like is just talking to people. But there's some value actually in more formalized interview processes, I think. The one thing I would add, by the way, is you started this with saying like, it should be okay for Dan to say, I'm interested, and for Roy to say, I'm not. I'm interested, Dan. But what I actually do as an interviewer is actually taking the step back and actually acknowledging that. And so I don't actually just say I'm interested. When I finish manager screens, so I'm hiring an engineering manager in San Francisco. I
see what you did there.
Yeah. And when I finish that manager screen, if I want to move forward, I actually say, hey, listen, I just want to be clear here. I'm going to put my cards on the table. I love this conversation. I love what you bring to the table. I would like to move forward, but as I said in the beginning of this has to be a two-way street. So I want to explicitly ask, do you want to move forward? Is there something interesting for you here? This is also, by the way, why I don't ever congratulate people for getting through the interview process, because it's not some sort of prize. Us being interested in you is not you winning. Us being interested in you is us winning. And so let's be clear that us being interested in you, like that should never implicitly mean, obviously you're going to come work here. That just means we're interested. What about you?
So yeah, the structured questions thing, I just want to go around that maybe another couple of times. So where I've seen this, well, it's a thing you can easily over-index, right? So particularly in the public sector, there is a list of actual questions, and they ask these questions. And I'm sure you've seen, certainly a bunch of people here will have seen the smackdown of the Google recruiting process, where they say, tell us about some blah, blah, blah memory thing, and because they use the wrong word in the answer, the Google recruiter says, no, that's wrong. Okay, the person's got 20-odd years experience and clearly knows what they're talking about, and because computer said no a couple of times, they fail. Where I think you're absolutely right, and this is actually another part of the stuff that I remember from ThoughtWorks, is there is there's topics you want to cover, there's data, there's evidence that you want. So it may be that it says, we're going to cover these 5 things during this conversation, but I trust that you are enough of a empathic human being and a half-decent interviewer so that we will get to the end of the conversation and you've covered these things. You won't say, well, question 3 is this, Dan, and question 4 is this. We'll be talking, and you'll notice that we haven't covered the topic about whatever, and so that will be a question that you ask. So I think it's completely appropriate to say, by the end of this conversation, at this stage in the process, this is the evidence we want. These are the areas that we want to have covered off, because then we can compare like with like. And I'm a huge fan of that. I think having completely unstructured interviews you can fall into the liking and you can fall into the, all of the other kind of cognitive traps. Where the anti-pattern there, though, is where it's just a regimented set of things, and you might have you might answer something, and I think, wow, I really want to explore that. I will learn a lot more about you and about the fit by going there, but I have to answer question 6A now.
Yeah.
And we go down that road. So that's the kind of the anti-pattern piece I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I don't know that we can trust this list.
No, I don't think we can. Influence without authority, myth or reality. Do you want to do this?
It's reality.
It's reality. Right, what's the... No, so this is interesting. So Goldman Sachs, big scary investment bank. When you join Goldman Sachs, I've not worked there as an employee, I've spoken to them a few times, but it's like a well-known part of their culture, if you like, is when you join, there's like a boot camp type thing, onboarding, and you'll do that with maybe 20 other bright-eyed, bushy-tailed graduates or new starters from all across the business, from all across the globe. And it's a very deliberate strategy, because what happens is that creates you're bootstrapping your network. You spend a few weeks with the same people and you go through the same experiences and you come out of it and now you've all had the same experience. And then what happens is 2, 3, 5 years down the line, you're now all, middle managers or something, or team leads, or wherever your career took you. Assuming you're still somewhere in Goldman Sachs, you are now connected to the head of risk for Europe, and you're connected to the back office settlements. And so you've built this ad hoc network. And they talk about the way they measure people is through two things. They call it impact and influence. And impact is the effect you have as an IC, an individual contributor, and influence is the things that you cause to happen around you, right? So early on in your career, it's mostly impact, and then as you go up through the ranks or whatever, become more influential, it's about what you cause to happen. Influence, by its definition, is causing action outside of your sphere of direct control. My sphere of direct control, it's not influence, it's control. There's a word for it, right? Influence is where I cause action at a distance, where I don't control, okay? So is there influence without authority? I'd say the definition of influence is causing action without authority. If I have authority, I use authority, right? If I don't have authority, I need to lean on influence. And so, and I see this a lot. I see really influential people, again, they don't manipulate or coerce, they paint a picture. They create an image in my head of a really exciting thing, and I want to be a part of that really exciting thing, and I want to go on that journey. So I think it's worth investing in your ability to influence. It's a set of learnable skills, okay? It's not this magic black art. Influencing skills are a learnable set of skills. They are an enormously valuable learnable set of skills, and I'd say especially as you progress through organizations, your ability to influence isn't just about, isn't just, the last thing it should be is about your own self-advancement, right? Your ability to influence should be about improving a situation. And so you need to recognize the situation can be improved, recognize where the levers are, where you want to be able to influence, and then being able to influence effectively. If you can line up all those things, you can cause really great things to happen. And again, when you get to do this, someone earlier was asking me, I said, what's your purpose? What drives you in work? I think that's probably too grand of a question for me to answer. I don't really know. What I do know is I get enormous satisfaction from going into environments that are broken, that feel toxic, that feel like there's low energy, burnout, all those things where people are having a sucky time, and doing stuff such that people have a less sucky time. So I was working at an American bank a few years ago, and we did this with 500 people. And after about a year and a half of doing some fun things, mostly about flow and lean operations and theory of constraints and all other good stuff, 500 people were clearly having way more fun and were measurably 4 times as effective in the bank. In the first year, they became twice as effective, i.e. halved the lead time and doubled the throughput of this entire group within a year. And then the following year, because now they were getting a hang of it, they halved their lead time and doubled their throughput again. right? So the results, the bottom line results were phenomenal, and people were clearly having way more fun, right? So one of the people who was an architect behind that, and I use architect in the informal sense of caused it to be, rather than the formal sense, because we were just talking about architects and why they suck, he's now moved on to another bank, and he's moved into a much, much more broken part of a much bigger bank. Like, why are you there? And he said, Dan, he said, we did this work and we managed to impact 500 people. I said, yes. He said, right, well, I'm now in the infrastructure part of a really big bank. So anyone who's ever worked in a bank, the engineering part, all of the operations people hate the engineers, all the trading people hate the engineers. All the engineers hate infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is the puppy that gets kicked by everyone, right? And so what has he done? He's gone and embedded himself smack in the middle of infrastructure. What are you doing there? If we can fix this, we can improve the lives of 25,000 people. Right? I'm like, that's a pretty ambitious, that's a pretty lofty goal right there. That's influence, right? So what he's trying to do is this lovely jiu-jitsu move in the middle of the infrastructure part of a very big, very dysfunctional bank. If we can pull this off, and it's a big if, and it's going to take a bunch of time, and the signs are looking good early on, we get to 25,000 people will come into work and have a better day in the office, right? That's cool. I like that. I don't to a first approximation, I don't care that what they do is run a bank, right? Really, if you pan back and look, what they're doing is enabling a German housewife in Dusseldorf to go to an ATM and get some euros out and feed her family, which is kind of cool. Or they allow a student to apply for their first mortgage, right? So there's a whole bunch of things they're doing. But there's a bunch of human beings who work in this huge organization, and this bunch of human beings are, hopefully, with that influence, having a much better life. So I think influence necessarily is causing action at a distance beyond any authority you might have.
I'm going to teach you some Hebrew here.
Oh, teach me some Hebrew.
You talked about your purpose, and you said there wasn't anything grand like that. It's just like you wanted to sort of, make working someplace better. I'm very clear what my purpose is.
Roy,
And
can you speak louder?
I'm sure I can. I'm very clear what my purpose is, and I've talked to people about this, and I explicitly talk about it this way. I did a talk at the Wix Engineering conference yesterday, and it was kind of a very personal talk. It was about sort of like how my background as an Israeli kid affects the way I lead, both for better and a lot of times for worse. In addition to being Israeli, I'm Jewish. And for me, my purpose at work and everywhere is a term called tikkun olam. It literally translates to fixing the world. And, it's not always like really big. It's like just, is the world a little better today than it was yesterday? And, that's why I do this thing. Because like that term in its purity and simplicity is what it's all about.
I like that.
So there you go. Tikkun olam. Take it. We're not going to make you an honorary Jew because that involves some things you might not like.
Now, see, technically,
Also-
so my mother was Jewish, so technically, I think.
I think you're not technically a Jew then.
No.
You're literally a Jew.
Okay.
Yes. You're gonna have to cut some things out of your diet now.
Oh no, I'm gonna have to lose some weight. Oh dear.
Oh, trust me, being a Jew does not require you losing weight. Should we move on to the
Yeah.
office time versus deliverables? How to stop staying in the office just to be seen? Can I answer this first?
Please. Oh, please. Isn't this your sweet spot? Isn't this Roy? Can you talk about what you do a bit?
It's interesting. I've been talking to people about my working hours, and my working hours for the last 2-3 years in 2 different companies is I get to work somewhere around 6:30 in the morning because I get to both this company and the last company start working at 9:30 or thereabouts. So I get 3 hours where I'm not actually seen, and I actually get to do work, and then I get into meetings which are also work but different, and then I leave at 4, 4:30, 5 o'clock. And so far, that's not been a problem. I think that the solution to this, and I feel like I'm going to pull a Dan here,
Okay.
is it's not about whether or not you're staying in the office just to be seen. It's about whether or not the corporate environment has been set up to basically have being seen be the thing that you win. if your environment says you need to be seen in order to, have people think that you're delivering value, then the entirely rational thing to do is to be seen in the office. And the only thing to do about that is to change your environment so that's not actually a factor. Now, if you're a leader, you can actually start pushing against that for your own people. I've had a lifetime of basically rebelling against corporate environments and figuring out to what degree I can push in the right direction for my own organization. And there's a bunch of ways in which traditionally my organizations have not looked like the rest of the company, to mostly my manager's concern. And I've been allowed to do that for as long as I've been allowed to do that, and sometimes I wasn't. So you can change the culture within your own local area, but if that's the water you swim in, the rational thing to do is, well, to do that. So you got to change the water you swim in, I think. What do you think?
I concur. So I want to give you a couple of examples. And there's an obvious corollary, or at least obvious, I guess, because I've seen it a bunch of times, corollary to we have this macho hours culture, which is, of course, being in an office for 10, 12, whatever it is, hours a day is exhausting. You won't be doing good work, and you need to pace yourself because you're going to be there for 10, 12 hours, right? So what happens? You don't do much. Right? You don't do much because you're exhausted, because you're in the office for 12 hours. Brilliant. Bring that on. Yeah. So I blame everything on cost accounting. Right? Okay, so I just do. So this idea that you're all assets, all these people are assets, and I pay you money, and so the way I get value out of all you people is I sweat my assets, right? I need you to work, and I need you to be busy. So I measure things like utilization. Who has timesheets here they have to fill in, and project codes and cost codes and that kind of stuff? No? Few people? Yeah? Okay. And we have this obsession with kind of tracking time and project money and kind of stuff, because we have this false equivalence between busyness and results. And when you start looking at flow economics, so rather than looking at how busy people are, you look at how work is flowing through an organization or not flowing through an organization because it's stuck in big queues all over the place, then the economics of the whole thing changes. So, and again, as I said, so when there's one group of 500 people, we halved lead time, doubled throughput, and we were sending people home on time. Right? So no one was working long hours, and we made that cultural. So there's three things you can do to cause behavior change. There's kind of technical, legal, and social. Right? So I can introduce a technological solution that makes you follow the rules. I could introduce legislation that makes you follow the rules. Or I could introduce social norms that make you follow the rules. One of these is much more powerful. So in the UK in the 70s, I don't know what it was like here, but drink driving was just normal. Everyone would drink drive. We've got cop shows from the 70s and literally TV shows, and they drink a pint of beer and go out and jump in the car and chase the baddies, right? And the baddies have just had a couple of whiskeys. This is normal, yeah. And the UK government was like, people are dying, this is really bad. And also people are dying because they're not wearing seatbelts. So not wearing seatbelts and drink driving, and just do the math, yeah. And
so the lesson here is, if you're going to drink and drive, wear your seatbelt.
Wear your seatbelt, at least wear your seatbelt drunk, right? But what they did, which is rather genius, is they made it, so let's say it was already illegal, but they made it anti-social. So instead of like, oh, I've had a load of beers and I only get in my car because I'm cool and a bit of a rebel, they'd be like, Dan, you're an idiot. That'd be stupid. Why would you do that? You're an idiot. It's like, oh. And so you made getting in a car drunk stupid. And once you make something stupid, people don't do it anymore. And so this happened, this was almost like a flip. It was almost instantaneous. It took a small number of weeks. Is when I suggested to this group of people, that we were going to halve lead time and double throughput, this one guy, I remember really vividly, he just freaked out. I was like, what's the matter? He said, I'm already working 100 hours a week and I never see my kids and I'm working weekends and you want me to double my throughput. How am I going to do that? And I said to him, by going home on time. And he was like, you just saw this tilt, right? What? I was saying what we've been doing is measuring the workers. What we need to do is measure the work going through the system. And if we measure the work going through the system, we will realize that we are working spectacularly ineffectively. If we're doing this right, we're going to have a lot more time on our hands. Well, the work will be flying through the system because we've eliminated all the work in process and we've figured out how to join up all the value streams so work gets done and we all get to go home on time. And we made it culturally not okay to be there after 6 o'clock. If you were still there after 6 o'clock, you clearly didn't know how to manage your day, right? If you can't get your work done before 6 o'clock, what were you doing? Yeah? And probably what you were doing was you were stuck. Well, now that's not your fault that you're stuck. It's not the plant's fault that it doesn't grow because the soil's bad, right? So, well, let's figure out how you can get your work done better. Let's figure out where the constraints are around you. And so we introduced a culture where if you were in before 8 in the morning, and some people would come in early because they wanted to go home early and spend the evening with their kids. That's fine. That's a choice, right? And we had kind of core hours around that. But if you were in early because you had a bunch of stuff to do, or you were working late because you had a bunch of stuff to do, that wasn't cool. Sometimes there's a push on, and sometimes, we just double down for like a week or something, and that was okay. If we want to kind of really go for it to hit a date or something, absolutely fine. If that becomes how we do work, we're doing it wrong. And so we shifted the culture into, can we be more sensible about it? And again, we made the drink driving thing uncool. And once we made it uncool, people were like, what on earth was I thinking? It's like they wake up from a dream. I thought this was normal. But again, exactly as you're saying, Roy, it needs that management oversight. We had the director of this part of the bank, and to be fair, he had some clout, right? This part of the bank dealt with $1 trillion a day in flow trading, right? So he had quite a big hammer to use. And he said, my organization, my division will work more effectively if. And they just left him there hell alone. And then once they saw double the throughput and half the lead time and blah twice, they were like, whatever you're doing, it's working. Send your people home on time. And so you can cause that cultural shift, but the shifting the cultural norms is much more effective of a lever than kind of just mandating stuff.
Yep. I'm good. We haven't yet actually archived the top 2.
Scrolling.
While you're doing that, I'm going to try to get back on their Wi-Fi and see if we can actually archive these.
Are there certainly certain processes and procedures that, from your experience, worked well? Are there just things that are generally a good idea? Shall I kick this off while you're
Oh, please do.
tapping?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'll keep saying it. I'm in the land of Ellie Goldratt. I'll keep banging on about it. We've got all the wrong models. We've gotten very, very good in business at doing exactly the wrong thing, right? And the thing that both breaks my heart and fills me with hope is it's really, really easy to do the right thing. It's just, as Goldratt says, common sense isn't common practice, right? So things that I see work well is model the way that value is created through your organization. Whose needs are you meeting? Who are the users? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the consumers of the work you do? And figure out how that work flows through the organization, model that, see where it's stuck, go after where it's stuck, and then it will present as stuck somewhere else and go after that next, and it's just an iterative process called theory of constraints. When you model flow and you start measuring how work moves through the organization rather than measuring how people behave, you find that you unlock people. So necessarily in any system of work, parts of the system will be at capacity and other parts will be under capacity if you've got good flow. And the parts that are under capacity, guess what those people are doing? What are those people doing who have time on their hands? Are they goofing off? Right? Probably not. Probably not if they care, right? What they're actually doing is probably thinking about how to improve things. Yeah? So they're probably having the next great idea. They're probably learning something that means that when the next bunch of work comes along, they're going to be more able to consume that work. We've gotten into this model. And the model came from the early 20th century. It came from a thing called scientific management, which, again, people go, oh, scientific management is all rubbish. It wasn't, it was brilliant. So scientific management was invented by a guy called Frederick Taylor, Henry Ford, Henry Gantt, the guy who invented the Gantt chart. These were very, very smart people. And what they realized was they were bringing in people into the factories, and the factories were producing the same thing again and again and again. They're building cars and bits of machinery and whatever else. And most of these people were coming in from outside of towns. They were semi-literate, okay? They didn't really know how work worked. And they were coming in and they were basically injuring themselves. And so these folks said, well, okay, we need to have standard work practices, things we could teach people who haven't had an education so they can work safely. We want to give them the best tools that they can. If their job is screwing something in, let's give them a really high quality screwdriver rather than the butter knife they're currently using and they keep cutting their hand with it because it slips. Yeah? And that kind of thing. So the idea was, can we commoditize work so that semi-literate people can do it safely? And now let's project that forward into the 50s and 60s where we're moving away from manual production work into knowledge product development work, and we took all the same norms and all the same models with us. So rather than saying how do we get people who want to do good work and liberate them and set them free and let them do cool stuff, we said how do we control these people? So all of the hierarchies and structures that work in a industrialized factory setting are exactly the wrong thing in a knowledge work setting, but we did them anyway. So Goldratt in the 60s and the 70s and 80s starts looking at, he just applied physics actually to management, and he said, let's assume that there's some simplicity at the middle, at the base of all this, and the simplicity is this: the work's trying to move like that through an organization, and the organization's shaped like that, and these things are in direct conflict. If I can make the organization that shape as well, right, things are going to fly through. So processes and procedures that I think work, measure flow, measure lead time, obsess about lead time, obsess about cost of delay, right? Obsess about happiness, right? Happy people do good work. Motivated people do good work. When you go into a team and that team has energy, they can change the world, yeah? If you're seeing demotivated, flat people, if you're seeing people measured by their activity, oh my goodness, is it low-hanging fruit. It's so easy to fix that, yeah? So those are some of the things I go after, and I see that work again and again.
I'm good. And we should be actually up to date on the Wi-Fi. I'm actually going to, sorry.
Oh yeah, we have new top things, do we? So if you scroll down, you just 2 fingers scroll down.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Did you?
So now I can bin some of these things, right? So procedures and practices that work well. Boom.
Perfect.
When you scale up and grow, how do you move from a startup mindset to a corporate mindset? Oh, can I take this one?
Please.
Fantastic. So there's a rather wonderful chap called Simon Wardley, who has a really lovely metaphor for this. And he talks about, so has anyone come across Wardley maps? No? A few hands? Okay. So he talks about there's 3 types of leadership that you need at different stages of, not necessarily an organization, but typically like a product life cycle. So he talks about products being in one of 3 kind of stages, if you like. So you have Genesis, which is where you're exploring something and iterating on it. Then you have product or service, where you've kind of standardized something. And then you have like commodity or utility, which is where something is now, well, it's a commodity, it's everyone has access to it. And that you want different types of leadership at different stages through that. So you have, and he calls them pioneers, settlers, and town planners. Okay? So pioneers go in there and they explore things and they iterate and they don't mind screwing things up and making mistakes and they try things again and again and eventually they find something that works. And once it works, lose all interest. Right, where's the next shiny thing? Woohoo, off we go. Yeah? That is a particular type of leadership. Then as we start to productize something, then we move into a settler mindset. So a settler doesn't like the churn, if you like, of the pioneering thing. What they want to do is take a good idea and grow it and really make it into something. So these are your product development people, these are your the kind of people that will take a post-startup and start to scale it. And then your town planners, and again, it's a different style of leadership. Your town planners are people who are much more structured, deliberate thinkers. So they put in the infrastructure, they put in the processes, they put in the standards. And again, it's a different style of leadership. What I love about this model, and there's a whole bunch, so there's the Crossing the Chasm model, Geoffrey Moore, where he talks about from your pioneers, early adopters, early majority, late majority, laggards. Who wants to be a laggard? I'm a pioneer, I'm a laggard, right? Just you have a bunch of idiots over there. It suggests that the further you are, you're just way behind the curve, you silly old laggards. Whereas Ward's model, it says all three of these are first-class citizens, they're first-class styles of leadership and management. They necessarily work differently in different contexts. And you'll see this, you'll see certain people, this is down to human beings now, are really good pioneer leaders, and they might be able to transition to settler leaders. But the thing that made them an entrepreneur and a pioneer is exactly the thing that will make them a rubbish town planner, right? And likewise, if I have a town planner and I try to get that town planner to go into a pioneering context, what are they going to do? They're going to do what they know. They're going to try and impose structure and norms and whatever else. And everyone in that context is going to go, wow, what a crufty old idiot. What are you trying to do here? So understanding there's a personal thing. Figure out what you get excited by. And I used to think I was super pioneering, and maybe it's because I was younger, I don't know, but I'm not. I'm a really good settler. That's what I am. I will take someone else's idea and I'll grow it. Okay, when it gets to needing structure and whatever, I call that responsible adults. I'm not a responsible adult. He's a responsible adult, right? I get the grown-ups in, yeah? And the grown-ups, you want to see what he does? He's really good. I can't do what he does. So what do? I lean on that. I've been doing this for 25 years. If I was going to be good at that, I would be by now. I'm rubbish at it. Okay? What I do, though, is I surround myself with people who are really good at the things I'm not. So I find really good pioneers to work with, and I help them grow their ideas. I find really good town planners to work with, and I lean on that as the thing gets big enough and stable enough that it needs a grown-up now. So I think there's three very different styles of management, and understanding which stage your organization's in and finding leaders that fit that stage. It's the alignment piece is much, much more important. So ThoughtWorks did this. When they got to like 500 people, they flipped. 1,500 people. The CEO stepped down, and another CEO, Trevor Mather, stepped in. Who was, guess what? He was a brilliant, brilliant town planner. Yeah, and he scaled the organization. It worked really well. And now they have a group of CEOs that kind of co-run the organization because there's like thousands of them. They're huge. And so it becomes a very different shape of thing. So that.
You got me wrong, by the way.
Oh, right, really?
Yeah, so three things I want to add to that, but two in response to you. Mm-hmm. It's not just about leadership. I would argue that I've actually worked with engineers who are very clearly, I've worked with engineers who are town planners, I've worked with engineers who are settlers, I've worked with engineers who are
exactly.
pioneers.
People who respond to those contexts.
Right.
Yeah. Or thrive in those contexts.
And the interesting thing is, like, I've talked to Wardley, I love that model, and I can tell you with certainty and evidence that I am a settler manager and a pioneer engineer.
Really?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff that I wrote at my last company that is to one degree or another still works there, mostly because somebody rewrote it from scratch because it was just terrible. Because like my superpower as an engineer is to very quickly and shittily have something working to demonstrate that there's something there. And then I lose all interest in actually doing it well. And I move on to the next thing.
You described me in Cucumber.
Yes. And it's worth noting, I would argue that it's true that you want to think about the leadership style that you need for your current company, but I would argue that whatever leadership style it is, you probably want to seed the company with people who are different from that.
Yes.
Because otherwise you end up being like super sort of like, monoculture.
Yeah.
The other thing I would note is, and this goes back to a conversation you and I had yesterday, I want to demonstrate something, but I need an assistant, Shai. Would you like to volunteer? You like leading questions, right?
I really do. Yeah.
Thanks for volunteering. How old are you?
37.
Okay, good. In your head, can you like have a sense of how old you feel?
I feel 25.
So here's the thing. I've talked to a ton of people and asked them this question. I have literally never had anybody tell me that in their head they feel as old as they are. Some people feel way younger. Some people feel somewhat younger. I think the smallest difference has been like 3 years. For some reason, a bunch of people I've talked with like were 6 years younger in their heads. And companies have that same problem. Every company I've ever seen, actually in its head, I mean, you can't really sort of talk about this. This is sort of implicit and subtle. But in its head, thinks it's way younger than it is. And the problem is that if you still think you're a startup, you're operating differently from where you are. So I think that one of the things you need to do is you need to actually start thinking about how old are we really and what's appropriate for our actual age. And I think that that's an incredibly powerful thing. Leaders have a role in this. So for example, I recently wrote a set of sort of principles for how my engineering team should be operating. And I said, when you're smaller, when you're a startup, you're operating like every quarter matters because you're going to go out of business if you screw up this quarter. And 2 years from now doesn't matter because like if we screw up next quarter, 2 years from now is not at all relevant. But there's no conceivable future we need to prepare for where this company is out of business in 2 years. So the only thing we need to actually focus on is actually being a lot better for engineer for tomorrow. So be aware of how old you are as an organization, which is hard, and you're likely, if you're not going to explicitly ask this question, going to continue to think that you're way younger and thinner and more attractive as a company than you really are. Oh, you take this one. Effort estimates.
Do you believe in effort estimates of tasks? No.
Oh,
Any tips for good ways to do it? Don't. But don't not estimate, because that's irresponsible. Okay. So estimating effort is a daft thing to do. Not estimating is a daft thing to do. What you estimate is when. Okay. Estimating lead time is a sensible thing to do. And if I estimate when I can do something by, and I have a team that's going to probably be responsible for that thing, I have a burn rate, and I can call that effort if I want. But actually, effort, again, doesn't matter, right? Getting the work done matters. So what I will typically do is I will do a macro estimate. I have a model called Blink Estimation. If you Google Blink Estimation, there's an article I wrote about it, one of the few things I blogged. But essentially, it's based on a well-worn investment model called wideband Delphi estimation. Folks who are in my class today, they hear me say it all again. It sounds familiar. So the idea is you get a bunch of people who've done things like this before, and you ask them. And I was at ThoughtWorks back in the day, probably mid-2000s. And they, back then, I don't know what they do now, it's 10 years ago, but back then they had a big spreadsheet. And what you'd do is you'd break out the customer, whatever we were bidding for, into a big list of features, might be hundreds of features. And there was a spreadsheet with 7 columns in, and it was things like low likely, minimum likely maximum, duration. There was like a volatility, risk, just a bunch of made up numbers, right? And did this like 200 times. It was soul destroying. So you do, like literally days locked in a room going through line items, and then you'd roll there, and this spreadsheet would figure out how much, whatever. And I came out of one of these things. I've been there for a couple of days, and one of my colleagues, senior engineer, said, "Dan, you look dreadful. What's the matter?" I said, "I've just been locked in a room for 2 days doing estimates." And he went, "What did you end up with?" I said, "Well, we're building, it's a website for a customer, and it's going to be a web application, blah, and it's going to cost pounds." And he said, "You're kidding." I was like, "No." He goes, "My grandma could do it for that." And I was just like, "Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is ridiculous. We're supposed to be good at this, right?" And it was just some enormous number, and it didn't make sense. And then, so I was a little bit kind of battle weary. And then the phone rang, and it was an inbound call, and a new client saying, "Can you build me this thing?" And it was a media company, and they wanted us to refresh their entire website, and it was for like one of these TV kind of reality shows where people get voted off and whatever else. So you can imagine the website is like, it's basically dormant for the entire week apart from for 2 hours on a Saturday night or whatever, when it goes completely insane because everyone's doing online voting and is like, you know, really, really spiky, and then dormant again. So it had to be really resilient, really weird traffic patterns. And anyway, could we build this thing? And I was like, I'm not doing that bloody spreadsheet again. So what I did is I was just standing in the car, literally I was standing in the corridor, and I've like tester, analyst, business development person who's done some work in media companies, couple of devs, right, get in a room, here's what the brief is, chat, what do you think? And on an index card, we wrote what we thought. This many people for this long. And we held them all up, and they were all about the same. So I went, right, that's it then. So I phoned this person back, and I said, well, we think it's going to cost this much, which is this many people for this long. And he said, how did you come to that figure? And I was like, there's two ways this goes. So I thought, better tell him. So I said, well, what I did was I grabbed a bunch of people with like 10 to 15 years experience each and pulled them in a room, and I described what we're trying to build, and I asked them how long it would take. And then we all ended up sort of agreeing on this. And he said, well, that sounds pretty sensible. I was like, yes, right. And so we did it, and really what we were doing was an investment conversation. It wasn't an estimate. It was, we think you need to invest X in building this thing. And of course, as we build this thing, we'll be iterating on it and measuring it and playing down risk and uncertainty and all that stuff. And we built it, with this many people in that much time, and it was a real success. And so that's kind of how I go about estimating now. There's no value in micro-level estimating. I would say it's not even a learnable skill. Where there is value is in being able to answer the I part of an ROI conversation. How much should I expect to invest in order to get this kind of an outcome? And then I flip it around, like, well, I want to get a car. Well, what kind of car? You could get like a $500 car or a $50,000 car. And depending on how much you want to spend on a car, you're going to have very different expectations on what that car looks like, right? And I'm going to have very different expectations on what kind of car I'm going to build you. So we might go back and forth on it a bit. Let's look at some options of cars you could have. But those kind of investment discussions are really, really valuable and really useful. The pointless estimation dance that we do in big I don't get that. And especially the work breakdown reductionist thing where we think we can take something that is massive amount of unknowns, that is likely an emergent, a complex adaptive process anyway, and pretend it's a reducible problem is just silly.
I'll add one short thing to this, and then I wonder if we want to take like a 10-minute break or something because people have been sitting for a long time.
Oh yeah, we should.
If you have some sort of chain of things you need to deliver, and you're so excellent at that you can estimate the effort for any one of them within like 90% precision. Anybody want to pull out a calculator and figure out what like 0.9 to the 10th ends up looking like?
Oh yeah.
It's pretty horrifying. So, people think that you can estimate, and I think that, generally speaking, they're wrong.
Can I just ask you to elaborate on that 0.9 to the 10th? Because you made a leap in why that matters that I think.
So, I've seen project managers sort of say, well, as long as we can basically, if there are 10 things that need to be done for this project, and first of all, I would argue that 90% precision for estimation is absurdly high for anything but the very most commoditized thing, which should at this point be automated anyway. But if there are 10 things that are basically critical path of each other, and we estimate each of them to about 90% accuracy, then generally speaking, it's going to be pretty good accuracy for the overall delivery of the project. But these things basically multiply against each other. And as a result, if you want to figure out sort of like what your likely precision for overall delivery of this thing of 0.9 for 10 items, you basically have to do 0.9 to the 10th, which tends to kind of actually suck. And then project managers get unhappy for some reason, which I think is actually why project managers choose to be project managers, but that's a different thing.
So the myth of 90% confidence. 90% confidence interval. Can anyone tell me, anyone with a stats background, tell me what a 90% confidence interval means?
Do I count?
Yeah, go on.
It's basically in answer to a question of like how much or some sort of quantified number, it's the interval that I have about a 90% confidence includes the right answer.
There's a tiny, tiny thing that you're missing there. That's a nearly complete answer. For a statistically significant sample. So here's the thing. Let's say I was doing a distribution system. I'm delivering goods to homes, right? And I want to figure out where to place my warehouse. Then what I might do is model all the places that might want deliveries, and I can model me delivering things, and I can say, I want to place my warehouse so that I have a 90% confidence interval of delivery within 2 hours. What that means is this. Over time, when I have hundreds or thousands of deliveries, 90% of them happen within 2 hours. That's a really useful operating metric. It tells me nothing about any one delivery. That one delivery could be anywhere on that spectrum, including way off to the long tail, right?
Well, that's only tied to the recording, so I don't think it's going to make any noise.
Tells me nothing. We'll take a break. Okay. It tells me nothing about this one time. And so when we say, can I have a 90% confidence interval for this project, which is why the entire thing is a complete charade, what I'm saying is if I were to run this project, this exact project with these people at this point in time, a statistically significant number of times, which is more than 20, right? 20 is your absolute minimum bar for statistical significance, then I would expect that about 19 of those would come in within my timeline. I'm going to run this project once. A 90% confidence interval is meaningless for a single point sample, right? So when people say, can I have a 90% statistical what they're really saying is, I don't understand stats and I'd like you to go and do some pointless work. And you're allowed to say, I'm not going to give you a 90% confidence interval because I went to school. I'm going to stop speaking now.
I don't want to get into a semantic conversation about what great culture looks like. I will say we have two factors here. One is huge company, the other one enterprise software market. I'm not here to represent Slack, but I will say Slack thinks of itself.
Other messaging systems are available.
Other less good messaging systems are available. But I will say Slack thinks of itself as an enterprise software company and has one of the best cultures I've ever worked in.
How many are you now?
I'm just one.
Well, how many are
Thank God for that.
How many are all y'all, the plural you?
Slack is about 1,100 people now.
1,100.
So that's the thing, right? I want to separate huge from enterprise software.
Yeah.
I have evidence that you can be an enterprise software company. Oh, and actually, here's the other thing. Workday, I would argue, is an enterprise. Well, they're SaaS, but they're enterprisey. There's a bunch of enterprise software companies.
Salesforce, actually. A bunch of folks I know work at Salesforce, and they're having an absolute blast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think you can absolutely have a great culture as an enterprise software company. I think Salesforce, which at this point I think like outnumbers some small countries.
Oh, they're insane. Yeah.
Yeah. If they have a great culture, then that's some evidence that you can have a great culture. I think, look, actually, I'll tell you this. We tend to be attracted to what good culture looks like when you're small. But I have seen plenty of very small companies with terrible culture. I've seen plenty of large companies with terribly bad culture as well. But I don't think that size is a factor. This close. Yeah. I don't think size is a factor. I think what happens is if you pay attention to your culture, if you say our culture matters to us, we are going to be explicit, we are going to be conscious, and we are going to be highly allergic to anything that messes with our culture, you can have a great culture in any size company. It just means that the larger you are, probably one of the things you have to pay the most attention to is to what degree does everybody working in your company understand they are the company rather than somebody who works in your company.
So yes, and I completely agree with that, and I'm going to add something, which is I see a strong correlation between culture as, small c culture certainly, like how people are and how much fun they're having and all that, and alignment of purpose in an organisation. So in other words, again, how well set up the organisation is to do what it's trying to do. And there's two types of scaling I see. One is when you scale in this very hierarchical, structured way, and now you are completely misaligned with your purpose, and everyone's day job is trying to navigate the mess and the disconnects that engages, including things like, the travel lockdowns for 2 months of the year because someone in a different department isn't allowing anyone to fly and all that shenanigans, versus large companies that still manage to align their structure and their operations with their primary purpose. And they keep that primary purpose front of mind. So everyone in the organization, as well as being the organization, they can see their purpose in the organization. They can see how the work they do directly contributes to the success of that organization. And when you have that direct line of sight, people generally are just much happier in the work they're doing. So it's when you can't see why what you do contributes to the whole, you kind of just tend to start making stuff up to fill the gaps. And I think that's where the danger starts.
I want to add something to that. One of the things that happens in larger companies, I think more than in smaller companies, and this is another sort of thing you can be responsible for, is I ended up writing a blog post once called The Failure of Us. And as a company gets bigger, it's not just
failure of the US. No?
I can write a lot about that, but no, it's a failure of us, right? And the thing is, like I talked about whether or not you feel like you are the company versus work for the company. And you talked about alignment of what I do, to the company, but there's also the, whether or not I sense that somebody else has that alignment. And as companies get bigger, we lose that sense of us, or actually that sense of us, like we always have that us, but just like we talked about earlier, like we're always younger in our heads than we are, that version of us becomes smaller and smaller and smaller as a factor of the company. I once worked in a 3-person company. It was my 2 best friends who lived above me in the upstairs apartment, and me, and we're the partners who started the company, and us was us 3, right? But if you work for any company larger than like 100 people, then there's a risk. There's like a daily risk that you're going to have to like pay attention to, that us in your head is not all of these 100 people. It's like my engineering group, or as the engineering group gets bigger, like my team or whatever. And then there's us and there's not us. And that's where things start getting problematic, because then not us is somebody to either resist or comply with, and neither of those options is good. You should never resist. Ideally, strive to not resist or comply with anyone in your company. Be aligned. And I learned this at Netflix because I had a security organization, and I've typically hated any security people in the room who are willing to raise their hands? Okay. I've typically hated working.
They look like everyone else.
I've typically hated working with security people in my life. And then I worked at Netflix, where security was just like my partner, and it was just a delightful conversation. And I got to the point where I felt very comfortable going to security and saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing something kind of stupid. Can you like basically tell me it's stupid and I can walk away from it? And they'd be like, okay, yeah, that's stupid, but if you change this thing and that thing, then it's actually pretty good. And then I came to Slack, and at some point I was having a conversation with somebody at Slack, and I was like, listen, they're in security, and I was like, I've been taught that security is my friends and my partners, and that means that I'm not going to comply with anything you say. What I owe you is to actually understand what you're trying to do and actively support that as though it is my mission. And that means that if you ask me to do something and I don't understand why it makes sense, I'm just going to say, nah, man, we're going to need to have a conversation about this because I don't want to comply. And they said, that's awesome. So that's the other thing that happens with a larger company. We start complying with others rather than being aligned with them. But you can fight that. You can fight that, and you should.
That's interesting. There's an arc that I was reading about recently of compliance, cooperation, collaboration. So compliance is exactly that, is you tell me what to do and I just kind of do it because that's a way to have a quiet life. Cooperation is we can kind of do things to keep out of each other's way and then we can get on and do work. And then collaboration is we can figure out a way to stand shoulder to shoulder so we're facing the same direction. And it's worth looking at the various stakeholders that you interact with. Am I complying, am I cooperating, or am I collaborating? And whichever one I am, if I'm not collaborating, how do I up the stakes? How do I bring us more towards that aligned position?
Yeah, and just to be clear, look, there's a bunch of Israelis in the room. We don't need to tell you to be less compliant. But what you can do is not just be less compliant, but also drive for collaboration.
Yeah.
That's the next step.
For sure.
And I think we're done.
Fantastic last thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Good, thank you.